right on accumulating. This is one instance where the application of the biblical ideas is not out of date. It should be brought back, in my opinion. That would be awesome. You want relevance? How could that help change our lives in this country? That's pretty impressive. Anyway, the oldest form of these laws occurred in the Book of the Covenant. Now, a Hebrew slave was to go free in the 7th year, Exodus 21, verse 2. And the land was to lie fallow in the 7th year with the vineyards and olive trees unharvested, Exodus 23, 10 through 11. This is directly linked to observing the weekly Sabbath as a time when animals and slaves could be refreshed. This is the point of the Jubilee. Exodus 23, verse 12. And both follow the commandments not to oppress a stranger because Israel was enslaved in Egypt. These were laws against exploitation. The land law appears also in Leviticus chapters 25, verses 2 through 7, and an expanded version of the law of slavery and the remission of sin, the Shemitah and the LXX, the Greek. The Shemitah is the Hebrew idea of the remission of debt, whereas the Greek word in the Old Testament of the Greek is aphesis. This appears in Deuteronomy 15, verses 1 through 18, and this is another text that the 11q Melchizedek used. It's very interesting how she does this. Now, there was disagreement as to whether the Jubilee was the 7th Sabbath year itself or the year which followed. In other words, is it every 49 years or is it every 50? They adapted the every 50 years, and they used this as their time clock in their history, and this is what her chapter is about, discussing this time of Jubilee every 50th year. Significant events occurred every 50 years in the history of Israel, and she goes through this. She says, the Sabbath year was a time when the land and the people returned to their original state. In the Sabbath year, all Israel returned to the original state of creation, which was one of freedom. We love to tout freedom in this country. We have our freedoms. We need to defend those against all oppressors. The idea was sharing equally with the animals whatever grew of itself from the earth. The earth provides anyway, whether we harvest it or not. The earth does provide. We know that. Well, the Jubilee, this was called the Sabbath of Sabbaths. This was proclaimed on the Day of Atonement. This is Leviticus 25:9. And this is interesting because this was the most important festival for the Jews. This was the time when only the high priest took the holy name that he wore on his head into the Holy of Holies. And according to Eugene Sach's materials on the Embracing Cherubim, this was the time when atonement, a coming together, a fusion of God and mankind occurred. Not only individually, but collectively as a group of Israel. This is why the Zohar begins with this Knesset Yisrael, equating it with the rose of Sharon. Israel is a rose, the whole community. Not just some of the special super rich. Their money doesn't add 1 inch to their stature. They aren't any more special than anyone else. We are all equal on the Day of Atonement. See how merciful, see how great this is. All people participate and all people are elevated. That's just. That's just. Now, this Day of Atonement, the idea of the atonement was it itself is a rite. This is on page 35 of Margaret Barker. The atonement was a rite which restored the eternal covenant and enabled the whole creation. This is all of the earth, The trees, the water, the mountains, the valleys, the rocks, all of creation, the atonement was universal. Or as the Book of Mormon so powerfully puts it, this is the infinite atonement. Nephi got that right. For Joseph Smith to translate it in those terms is really impressive. This is the infinite atonement. We now know through scholarship. Joseph Smith is ahead of his time here. We know through scholarship now, Margaret Barker correctly notes, that it enables the whole creation, not just the community of Israel, to be restored to its original state. This is the principle. The original state is a paradise. This is what we are created for, not enslavement. So the Jubilee, what the Jubilee does, how it connects with the atonement, is it is a practical application of the atonement. So the key figure of the rite of atonement was the high priest. And he was a visible presence of the Lord. It's very interesting how she says this. And he is a visible presence of the Lord on earth. And just as the Lord had ordered the creation at the beginning, so he recreated it on the Day of Atonement at the new year. You see how all this conglomerates together. It's a beautiful, perfect system. This is what the 11Q Melchizedek fragment, this is the background to that fragment. The Jubilee recreated society by restoring people to their own land and by removing the burden of slavery and debt. In the Greek of Leviticus 25:10, it translates the key Hebrew word doror, which is liberty or freedom. You notice how the two are equated. Liberty is freedom. Freedom is liberty. It translates the word of aphesis. The Greek word aphesis means a remission. It shows that by the period, perhaps the 3rd century before the Common Era, the characteristics of the Sabbath and the Jubilee were combined together. And that's important to understand too. The Jubilee was still used as a measure of time. And we can see this by the Book of Jubilees. See, this is why the Book of Jubilees is such an important text also. Granted, it's not in the canon. At one time it was. But the Book of Jubilees is showing the history of Israel through this 50-year Jubilee period. It's basically a rewrite of the book of Genesis. Kind of like the Genesis Apocrypha. And actually, it's not just Genesis, it's the entire early history of Israel as far as that goes. It's a very interesting text. James C. Vanderkam has some wonderful stuff on the book of Jubilees. The Jubilee was also closely linked to the role of the servant of the Lord as Isaiah understood him. He depicts the royal high priest of the first temple as the servant of the Lord. He was to release the prisoners, this is Isaiah 42:7, and he was to bring back Jacob and to gather in Israel, establish the land, and allocate desolate inheritances. Isaiah 45:5 and 9. The Targum of Isaiah, now the Targum, that's the Aramaic translation of the Old Testament. They use the Hebrew, and then the Aramaic is called the Targum. The Targum of Isaiah understood these passages to mean that the servant would bring back the exiles of the diaspora, bring them back from Babylon. They were taken captive Babylon, 600 BC. Now they were being brought back. This is one of the points of the servant. Bring back the exiles of the diaspora, and also bring Israel back to the fear of the Lord, another adaptation of the concept of the Jubilee.